Picture a Spanish royal census official, sometime in the 15 or 1600s, walking into a farming village on the Cantabrian coast with a checklist in hand. His job is simple: sort every household into one of two boxes, noble or not. He starts knocking on doors, and this is where his job gets strange. Nearly every man who answers has plow-calloused hands, patched clothes, mud dried into his boots, and nearly every one of them tells him the exact same thing: hidalgo, noble by blood, same as the farmer next door, same as the farmer after that. He's not being lied to. This is Castile, in a period when nobility ran at something like 11% of the entire population, against a European average closer to 1 or 2%. That number alone should stop you in your tracks. But in two specific corners of northern Spain, Vizcaya and Guipúzcoa, it gets even stranger. Hidalguía, there wasn't something you earned. It was universal. Every single person born on that soil was legally noble by default. Farmer, fisherman, blacksmith, all of it. Now hold on to a name for later, because it's going to matter a lot more than it sounds like it should. Vasco da Gama. Yes, that Vasco da Gama, the man who found the sea route from Europe to India and permanently rewired global trade. He got his own noble title 20 years after he did it. 20. Stay with that number. We're coming back for it. This is not a video about castles. This is not a video about knights riding into battle for glory. This is a video about a legal ladder with 6 named rungs, one nearly invisible rung above all of them that maybe 24 men in the entire kingdom ever stood on at once, and a farming village where, on paper, everybody was already noble and almost nobody was rich. Welcome to the strangest class system in early modern Europe: Spain and Portugal's nobility, floor to ceiling. Let's start at the floor, because that's where this ladder actually gets built. Rewind to the Reconquista, the centuries-long Christian push south against Muslim-ruled Iberia. Land was constantly changing hands, and every time a Christian kingdom pushed a frontier forward, it needed men willing to fight for it and settle it. So the crown paid in the one thing it had an endless supply of: status. Fight, hold the line, and your family's legal standing changed forever. That's where the word comes from, and honestly, it's one of my favorite etymologies in this whole period. Hidalgo is a worn-down contraction of hijo de algo, son of something. And something, in medieval Castilian, didn't mean some vague spiritual worth. It meant property, substance. A hidalgo was, by definition, a son of someone who had something, even if by the time you're standing in that muddy village 3 centuries later, the something had long since evaporated into a coat of arms and a tax exemption. Here's how seriously Castile took this. In the 1200s, King Alfonso the Learned commissioned a legal code called the Siete Partidas, the 7-part code, and buried inside its second part is one of the earliest formal legal definitions of hidalguía anywhere in Europe. The law states plainly that this is nobility that comes to a man through lineage, not through wealth, not through office. Lineage. And then the code gets almost eerily specific. Marry a commoner, and you can start bleeding that status out of your own bloodline. A hidalgo who married a villana, a commoner woman, put his children's inherited nobility at risk. This wasn't folklore. This was written law, with consequences a court would actually enforce. So picture the ladder Castile built on top of that law. At the very bottom, legally speaking, the pechero, from pechar, to pay, the ordinary tax-paying commoner, obligated to the crown in cash. One rung up, the hidalgo, exempt from exactly those taxes, entitled to bear arms, judged only by fellow nobles, technically protected from execution, without the king's own authorization. And above the hidalgos, a much smaller, older class called the rico hombres, literally, rich men, the true magnates, the ones who actually held land and armies and real regional power. And here's the detail that trips up almost everyone hearing this system for the first time. Hidalguía is not a rank. It's a type. You don't out-hidalgo your neighbor. Either your blood carries it, or it doesn't. Full stop. Which means, on paper, the poorest hidalgo farmer in Cantabria and the King of Spain himself belong to the exact same legal category. Same word on the same royal document. Wildly different lives. That gap between what the law said you were and what your actual life looked like is about to become the whole story. So let's actually look at that gap, because most people hearing medieval Spanish nobleman picture the same thing: a warm hall, a servant pouring wine, a family crest on a lot of expensive fabric, rich, comfortable, in charge. That picture is wrong for the overwhelming majority of hidalgos, and Spain's own literature was blunt about it in real time. Miguel de Cervantes didn't invent a poor knight-errant out of nowhere when he wrote Don Quixote. He wrote him as an aging hidalgo, specifically because broke but legally noble was a recognizable type his readers already knew from their own villages. A man with a coat of arms on the wall and nothing in the larder. And if you want a legal detail that proves just how far this could get stretched, meet the Hidalgo de Bragueta, informally, fly of the trousers hidalgo. Father 7 legitimate sons, and the crown granted you tax-exempt noble status on the spot. Fertility, not wealth, not lineage, not battlefield service. Just 7 sons. Spain's nobility system had, quite literally, a loophole you could father your way into. So here's the myth, named plainly. People assume nobility meant money. In this system, across huge stretches of the population, it very often didn't. It meant a legal category, tax exemption, the right to bear arms, trial only by fellow nobles, layered on top of a life that could look, from the outside, identical to your tax-paying neighbors. Above the mass of hidalgos, though, real distinctions start reappearing. And this is where Spain's titled nobility comes in. 6 ranks, each one legally sitting above the last. At the bottom of the titled tier, Señor, Lord, the oldest and simplest title, tied to holding lordship over a specific estate or town. Above that, Barón, a rank that, oddly, barely existed in Castile at all. It was mostly an Aragonese import, since Castile's kings never got in the habit of granting baronies of their own. Climb again, Vizconde, Viscount, a rank so structurally tied to the one above it that for a stretch, Spanish law wouldn't even let you become a count or a marquess without having held a viscountcy first. Then, Conde, Count, genuinely old, genuinely powerful, historically tied to land a count, actually governed. Above that, Marqués, originally the lord of a frontier march, a defensive zone, which tells you a lot about where marquesates first got handed out, exactly where the fighting was. And at the very top of the ordinary ladder, Duke, the highest rank a title alone could reach. 6 rungs, real, legally distinct, each with its own protocol and precedence. If that number surprised you, that Spain formalized a 6-step hierarchy this specific, on top of an entire separate category of untitled hidalgo nobility underneath it, that's worth a like right there. It's genuinely one of the more granular class systems anywhere in early modern Europe, and it's the kind of thing YouTube's algorithm only shows to more people if the engagement backs it up. But here's what nobody watching a costume drama ever gets told. Reaching Duke, the top of this 6-rung ladder, didn't automatically put you anywhere near the actual center of power in Madrid. There was one more level above all 6 ranks combined. A level so exclusive that, at its founding, it had exactly 25 members in the entire kingdom, and getting onto it had almost nothing to do with which of the 6 titles you held. Quick recap before we go up that last level: 11% of Castile, legally noble; 2 entire provinces, universally noble; 6 titled ranks, stacked on top of all of it. And still, the real center of gravity in the Spanish court belonged to a group so small you could fit the founding roster in a single room. This is exactly the kind of thing this channel exists to do. Take the version of nobility everyone's absorbed from movies and pull the actual legal record out from underneath it. If pulling that thread is useful to you, subscribing means you catch the next one. That level is called Grandee of Spain, Grande de España, and it sits completely outside the 6-rank ladder we just climbed, not above Duke in the normal sense, beside it in its own separate category with its own separate rules. The privilege that came to define it sounds almost absurdly small at first. The right to keep your hat on in front of the king. Cubrirse, to cover oneself. In most of Europe, that would get you arrested. In Spain, for a tiny handful of the most trusted magnates, it became the single most recognizable marker of belonging to the innermost circle of the crown. The custom traces back to the late Middle Ages, among the ricos hombres we met earlier, but it wasn't formalized into an actual defined class until 1520, under Charles I, better known outside Spain as the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. And when he formalized it, he immediately did something very deliberate. He capped it. 25 grandees, not 50, not 100. 25 men in the entire kingdom, holding the single highest mark of royal trust available to a subject. Even within that tiny group, Spain built a hierarchy so granular it verges on theatrical. Grandees were split into 3 historic classes, and the difference between them came down to the exact choreography of covering your own head. The first class spoke to the king and got his answer with their hat already on. The second addressed him bareheaded, then covered themselves only to hear his reply. The third had to wait for the king's explicit permission before they could put their hat on at all. 3 classes, 1 king, all decided by the timing of a single hand gesture. And here's the part that actually matters more than the ceremony. Grandeeship is not the same thing as a title. You could be a duke and not a grandee. You could, more rarely, be a grandee without holding any of the 6 titled ranks at all, which produces a genuinely strange outcome in Spanish protocol. A grandee who only holds the rank of baron outranks a duke who isn't a grandee. Title tells you what land or family history you carry. Grandeeship tells you where you actually stand with the crown. 2 completely different questions, and Spanish nobles spent centuries chasing the second one far harder than the first. Nobody chased it more effectively, or more ruthlessly, than Fernando Alvarez de Toledo, 3rd Duke of Alba. Grandee of Spain, Knight of the Order of the Golden Fleece, chief military advisor to both Charles V and his son Philip II. Alba's resume reads like a tour of the Spanish Empire at its most aggressive, commanding imperial armies in Tunis, governing Naples, governing Milan. But he's remembered, when he's remembered at all, for what he did in the Netherlands starting in 1567, a tribunal historians call the Council of Blood, which set aside local law entirely and condemned somewhere around 12,000 people for rebellion. I want to flag something honestly here, because historians don't fully agree on it, and you deserve to know that rather than get a false sense of certainty, exactly how concentrated hidalgo status was in specific regions of northern Spain, whether Asturias sat closer to a quarter of the population or considerably higher, depends heavily on which census year and which historian's methodology you're reading. The scholarly consensus is clear that it was extraordinarily high by any European standard. The precise number is still genuinely, actively argued over. If you've got a source or a theory on that one, the comments are open. What isn't in dispute is what happened to the Duke of Alba next. In 1580, Philip II sent his most feared general across the border. Not into the Netherlands this time, but into Portugal. Alba's Portuguese campaign didn't just succeed. It worked so completely that Philip II effectively absorbed the Portuguese crown onto his own head, launching 60 years where Spain and Portugal shared a king. Which raises an obvious question, one you've probably been sitting with since we crossed this border. What did Portugal's own nobility even look like underneath its new Spanish management? Structurally, it's the same family tree as Spain's, same filio de algo root, same instinct to rank status with almost bureaucratic precision, but the branches grow differently. At the top of Portugal's blood nobility sat the fidalgos de Casa Real, nobles of the royal house, followed by cavaleros, knights, then escuderos, squires. In 1572, King Sebastião formalized the whole court hierarchy into 12 separate graded ranks of distinction. 12, not 6. A system so layered, It makes Castile's ladder look almost restrained by comparison. And here's the one structural difference that actually matters most for how power worked day to day. In Portugal, holding the rank of Count, Marquis, or Duke came with grandeza automatically built in. No separate ceremony, no separate royal grant to chase afterward. Spain forced its nobles to climb the title ladder, and then separately lobby the crown for the cubrious privilege on top of it. Portugal just folded the two together. Same ingredients, genuinely different recipe. Which brings us, finally, back to the man we left waiting 20 years ago. Vasco da Gama came home from India in 1499, as close to a living legend as the Portuguese crown had. No title followed. He kept advising King Manuel on maritime policy for 2 decades, watching other men get rewarded around him, apparently getting nothing but royal correspondence in return. Then, in 1518, a fellow explorer named Ferdinand Magellan did something drastic. He defected to the Crown of Castile, taking his expertise straight across the border to Spain. And almost immediately, King Manuel moved. By December 1519, da Gama had his title, First Count of Vidigueira. 20 years of loyal service got him nothing. One rival's threat to walk got results within months. That's the kind of detail that's genuinely fun to bring up at dinner and watch someone's face change. The man who connected Europe to Asia by sea had to be scared out of him before Portugal would actually pay up. The ladder wasn't fully sealed shut either. Centuries later, a man named Antonio José de Ávila climbed every rung of it from nothing, ending up the only commoner-born duke in the entire history of the Portuguese peerage. Proof that under the right circumstances, the system that spent centuries protecting inherited blood could still let one self-made man all the way to the top. But the moment that actually decided where Spain's nobility and Portugal's nobility stopped being one story and became two happened on a single morning. The 1st of December, 1640. Traditionally counted at exactly 40 conspirators, Portuguese hidalgos, the sons of something class, done waiting. A plot that had been building for months finally moved. They killed the Spanish-appointed Secretary of State, Miguel de Vasconcelos, and threw his body from a window. They arrested the Spanish vicereine, Margaret of Savoy, Duchess of Mantua, and took the palace. Within hours, they'd proclaimed John, Duke of Braganza, their new king. On the 15th of December, he was crowned John IV of Portugal, founder of a dynasty that would rule until the 20th century. This is not a peasant uprising against a distant king. This is not a foreign army crossing a border. This is 40 Portuguese noblemen deciding, on their own authority, that their king wasn't Portuguese enough anymore, and having the standing, the arms, and the court connections to make that decision stick. And here's the detail that makes the whole thing land differently. John IV's own wife, Luisa de Guzman, was the daughter of the Spanish Duke of Medina Sidonia, a grandee of the exact system his coup had just permanently split away from. The two aristocracies didn't stop being related. They just stopped being one government. And while that split was happening back home, a very different version of this same status game was already running an ocean away. Spain didn't just keep Hidalguía inside its own borders, it exported it as a recruitment tool. When Juan de Oñate led colonists north into what's now New Mexico in 1598, the crown's offer to the men willing to stick out 5 years of settlement included exactly this: guaranteed hidalgo status, on top of tax relief and grants of encomienda, the right to extract labor and tribute from the native population living on that land. Nobility, quite literally, as a signing bonus. But status built on a signing bonus doesn't travel well once nobody's left to check the paperwork. By the 1630s in Spanish Peru, Hidalguía had drifted so far from anything verifiable that a Lima municipal official complained outright, on the record, in 1635, that anyone who simply called himself a hidalgo got away with it. No lineage required, no siete partidas court case, just the claim itself. The same legal category that once needed a formal ruling on your parents' marriage back in Castile had, 3,000 miles from the nearest court that could check, becomes something you could basically just say out loud and have people believe. 6 centuries later, you don't need a coup or a coat of arms to recognize what's actually going on underneath all of this. A hidalgo with no land, no income, and a legal document proving his bloodline is basically the 16th century version of a vice president, with no direct reports and no budget. The title survives. The power it used to guarantee quietly doesn't. Spain and Portugal just built a 600-year-old, extremely well-documented case study in exactly how that gap opens up, and how long a title can keep working after it does. One more thing before we climb down for good, because it changes how you should think about everything we just covered. None of this is fully in the past tense. Portugal abolished noble titles by law in 1910, when the monarchy fell. Spain never did. The Ministry of Justice still formally processes and confirms titles of nobility today. The same government office, doing essentially the same paperwork the crown did 500 years ago. And on both sides of the border, private heraldic bodies keep the old genealogies alive whether or not the state cares anymore. The Real Asociación de Hidalgos de España and the Real Cuerpo de la Nobleza de Madrid still verify bloodlines in Spain. The Instituto da Nobreza Portuguesa does the same in Portugal, with the Duke of Braganza himself, heir to the dynasty 40 conspirators put on the throne in 1640, serving as its honorary president. The ladder we just climbed never actually got torn down. It just stopped being load-bearing. So let's bring this all the way back down that ladder, one more time. First, hidalguía was never a wealth bracket. It was a legal category, inherited, enforceable in court, and completely separate from whether you could actually afford dinner. And grandeeship sat further outside that whole conversation than most people assume. A distinct honor a duke might chase for decades and never receive. Second, this system could absorb a full tenth of an entire country's population into its lowest legal tier, and real, unaccountable power still ended up concentrated in roughly 24 men who got to keep their hats on. Scale and power, in this system, were almost completely unrelated variables. Third, and this is the one that actually stays with me, status labels keep functioning long after the world that justified them stops making sense. A Lima official complaining in 1635 that anyone could call themselves a hidalgo and get away with it. A vice president title on a business card today with nobody underneath it. A private association still verifying 600-year-old bloodlines in 2026. Same mechanism, running on and on. So here's what I actually want to know. If you'd been born into this system, not chosen, just born, wherever the dice landed you on the Iberian Peninsula, somewhere between the 1200s and the 1600s, where do you honestly think you end up? Universal Hidalgo farmer in Vizcaya? Broke rural Hidalgo like Cervantes wrote? Or nowhere near a title at all? Tell me below, and be honest about it. I think most of us land further down that ladder than we'd like to admit. 25 men got to keep their hats on. Everyone else just kept farming. And in a few dusty registries, some of their descendants still technically are.